Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this week's PAVE virtual panel. We're going to get started really shortly. Just going to give folks a minute to come in from the waiting room here. As a reminder, you will be able to find the full recording of this panel as well as all of our previous panels on our YouTube channel at PAVE Campaign, also on our website at pavecampaign.org or on social media on LinkedIn. So welcome everybody officially to PAVE's 126th virtual panel. Today we are going to be talking about Seattle's Autonomous Vehicle Inclusive Planning Cohort, or AVIPC. Really excited about this topic. My name is Caitlin Magny Miller. I'm PAVE's Communications Director, and I will be moderating today. And I want to get started by introducing our guests. We have Armand Shahbazian of Seattle DOT, Charlotte Jernick of Uncommon Bridges, and Nico Larco of the University of Oregon. So welcome, everybody. Let's start with some intros. Can you each introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about your respective roles? Armand, want to start with you?
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. Hi, everyone. I'm Armand Shahbazian. I'm the Electric and Automated Mobility Policy Advisor at the Seattle Department of Transportation. I sit in the Mobility Solutions team. So in my role, I manage our autonomous vehicle testing and policy programs, and it sits in a suite of offerings, which includes our shared micromobility program, our TDM program, and other emerging mobility work.
Fantastic. Charlotte?
Hey everybody, I'm Charlotte Jernick. I'm a project manager with Uncommon Bridges, and I have a background primarily in community organizing, and I'm super excited to be here.
Awesome. Nico?
Hey, I'm Nico Larco. I'm a professor at the University of Oregon and direct the Urbanism Next Center in the Sustainable Cities Institute. And Urbanism Next looks at the impacts of emerging tech on cities, so very much on point with these topics.
Wonderful. Well, let's get into it. Armand, I'm going to come back to you here. The AVIPC really set out to assemble a diverse set of voices to provide input for an AV deployment process. Can you talk about how you pulled this cohort together and what communities you sought input from?
Yeah, so this effort actually was inspired by a previous project that we did a couple years ago, which was to recognize that people in Seattle really need a suite of mobility options available to them. So we launched a program called Ride Now back in 2022, which provided vouchers to older adults and people with disabilities to use Uber, Lyft, or Yellow Cab, essentially using options beyond fixed route transit, for example. And as part of that program, we used inclusive planning to have participants actually craft the program design. And so now, more recently, because we're grappling with autonomous vehicle deployments coming to cities, we took that same template of having community-led engagement for our autonomous vehicle policies. And so we brought together a group that represented very diverse voices to help craft how we should consider the city's approach to autonomous vehicle policies. So our cohort was 12 members, and about half of the members are from our Department of Neighborhoods Community Liaisons program. They're actually independent contractors who act as a bridge between the public and the city. And so we were able to represent all top 7 Tier 1 languages, thanks to our community liaisons that participated. And then we also invited folks from community-based organizations that we've worked with, like Disability Rights Washington and Seattle Neighborhood Greenways, for example, who are just members of the public who represent diverse voices. So we had older adults, people who use wheelchairs, for example, people who are blind, people who are formerly homeless. So we really wanted to represent a diverse set of voices as we thought about autonomous vehicle policies.
That's fantastic, and probably a number of voices who aren't typically included in those conversations. So that's wonderful. Charlotte, at the start of the AVIPC's engagement, the cohort identified 7 sort of core priorities. Can you tell us about those?
Yeah, absolutely. So from this really diverse cohort that we had, they put their heads together to identify the top priorities that they wanted to dive in deeper to understand not only the background and the research that Nico was able to provide, but what also the kind of guide or guardrails and barriers that SDOT was able to work within so that the group is really identifying some really sustainable and action-oriented solutions and recommendations to these specific areas. So those 7 areas were management and accountability, relating to AV operators tailoring deployments to benefit local communities as informed by community members. Workforce development and protection. So the AV industry should retain and rehire workers, extending beyond tech skills and utilizing like workforce redevelopment programs that are available through different sectors and different education avenues. Accessibility and affordability, that cities must enforce, not just promote, strong accessibility standards for AV deployment. Safety standards, combining technical elements with community input and the roles of safety standard setters, police, and AVs, and incident reporting must be clarified and determined by community members to ensure that there is equity across the safety standards that the cities are deploying. The environmental impacts, so key issues in the life cycles of the entire AVs, just the mega impact that AV deployment ends up having on energy grid stains, disability considerations, and alignment with green policy goals for, that specific area. Intersectional equity. So this was a really huge one that kept coming up through all of these more specific, kind of nuanced metrics that they were measuring and discussing, because the reality of AD deployment is that it will affect so many different sectors. So entering into deployment with a very intersectional mentality will help kind of increase the cohesion across these different sectors and assure that community voice stays at the center. And then the last was education back to community, that the strongest, most successful deployments will be influenced by community members, and increased communication streams between government, the industry providers, and community members will ensure that not only deployment, but kind of the sustainability and working through some of the bumps in the road that might happen as deployment starts to happen can be addressed, and ensure that that kind of equitable approach is at the center of deployment after all.
Great. That's fantastic. Nico, I'm going to turn to you here. Can you talk about how the cohort engaged on an ongoing basis, and maybe also what was unique about that process?
Sure. So the idea was, as both Armand and Charlotte talked about, trying to really get as much as we could from this really diverse cohort about these topics. But this is kind of a strange topic in that AVs, are largely not out there in the world. So there's a need to, on the one hand, help people understand what it was we were talking about. So, early on saying, like, what is an AV, or what are we considering as part of this, and some of what the ramifications of those things, and then getting a whole lot of feedback. So the way that we organized it was that there was meetings every other week with the group. It was a large commitment for everyone involved. You did this after kind of work hours. The first one was in person, but then after that, we did them all virtually. And each one of these were slightly different, but many of them started with a session to hear. The first session that we did was to hear about the key topics they wanted to cover, and Charlotte kind of outlined those. Those largely came from the community, right? Things that they really wanted to be talking about, things that were on top of mind. And then what we did is we had a series each week. We would take one of these topics and have a session with them. And the sessions started out sometimes starting out with reviewing some background information, research, the current what's happening in the world around these topics to kind of like set the stage. And then it was a lot of discussion and feedback from them of what they thought about those things, what they were worried about, what they were hearing, lots of conversations and digging into really their views. We also asked them for feedback afterwards via email if they wanted to. And each meeting we came back and said, this is what we heard last time. Does that sound right? So really trying to make sure that we were understanding things correctly. We also did one meeting where we invited some industry representatives to come in and talk to the cohort, so the cohort could ask some of their questions. This was later on in the whole process, so they'd already dug into a whole bunch of pieces and could ask questions directly. I think in terms of what was unique about the process, one, I think the range of different people that were involved in this, I mean, that was like really fantastic. I'd never been a part of something that on the one hand had such a diversity of stakeholders, and also was ongoing and like continuous discussion about these things where we could really dig into all the topics. So to me, that was like one of the really unique pieces. And the second one was the level of listening. Like, this was really, I mean, SDOT did a fantastic job of setting the stage of like, we want to hear from you. This isn't like we're doing something and we want a little bit of an input, or we're going to tell you what we're doing and give us a head nod. This is really like, I mean, as I said, the cohort largely came up with the topics that we should be covering. So it really came from them.
Very cool. Sounds like a very community-led operation and a very engaged group. Stepping back a little bit, Armand, why would you say it's so important to prioritize diversity when we're talking to the public about future mobility topics? And how do you select these particular community groups?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Cities are very dynamic and our transportation system is very dynamic. And we've seen over the course of time a whole plethora of transportation choices become available, especially as technology advances, many of these choices become more attainable for the public to use. But at the same time, we also recognize that there are certain elements that leave people out of accessing these technologies. And so we wanted to make sure that we were engaging with a very diverse group of people so that we could ensure that this suite of mobility options is available to them. I think cities, frankly, are very keen to be more on top of autonomous vehicle deployments, especially the shared mobility ride hail service, because of what we experienced with TNCs like Uber and Lyft, where they arrived so quickly and we were frankly very unprepared to deal with the impacts of having these services available. And now, TNCs do provide an important choice for many people, but they also leave out a lot of folks, especially people who are lower income, people with disabilities, older adults. And so we wanted to say, we recognize autonomous vehicles have such promise for safety, accessibility, transportation equity, but we really need to be representing that community voice and uplifting what those needs are so that we don't run into the same circumstance that we have with TNCs where we were caught flat-footed and we weren't able to have that deep level of engagement to make sure that the service meets community needs from the beginning. And so when it comes to how we selected these community groups, we've done a lot of engagement over time. This project launched at a very opportune time for Seattle. We just published our Seattle Transportation Plan, which is a 20-year visioning document for the city on transportation planning, and it does include a new and emerging mobility element, which obviously covers autonomous transportation. And so from that level of engagement that we did to create the Seattle Transportation Plan, we were really well set up to understand what we needed to do to talk to community as we prepare for autonomous transportation to become available.
Fantastic. Charlotte, I'm going to come back to you here. What were some of the biggest concerns or hopes even that community members had expressed about AVs throughout the process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, starting with hopes, so continuing to centralize the needs of community members is their biggest hope, right? Like to kind of echo and build upon what Armand was saying, the deployment of Lyft and Uber was hard, right? Like there was a lot of movement there that negatively impacted community. And so what was so beneficial about this process and really centering the cohort and centering their concerns and to like amplify what Nico said, like really stretching that listening exercise and practice, continue to center like their hopes for a better approach to the deployment of this, like really appreciating SDOT getting ahead of this and really asking community, like, what does it need to look like for this to go significantly better? So not only centralizing the needs of community members, but prioritizing workforce readiness and education was another huge one, really wanting the deployment of autonomous vehicles to be an opportunity to increase workforce development and help to kind of bring community members along with it rather than bringing in new members into an already kind of very like fulfilled area. Like Seattle has continued to grow in the tech space for the last 10 years. And so if we can utilize the workforce here that we have in the transportation sector and give folks the opportunity to kind of learn new skills and evolve with these evolving trends, it'll just increase kind of all ships rise with the tide, to be able to bring community members along with it. In terms of concerns, maintaining affordability and maintaining accessibility was definitely a top priority that the group had, that the deployment of autonomous vehicles will be viewed as something that is like a luxurious transportation opportunity rather than it being able to serve a lot of the accessibility like needs that it has the opportunity to fill, driving people to their different medical appointments, helping folks who are visually impaired be able to get around smoother, kind of wanting to maintain the accessibility and the affordability so that folks who would really benefit from having autonomous vehicles are able to access it. Awareness of the environmental impacts and the full life cycle of autonomous vehicles was another major concern that folks have, and just wanting to see the like Seattle Department of Transportation, as well as Washington State at large, just be really mindful about how you're planning to kind of move through those challenges, as well as safety standards, right? So as accidents occur, kind of the concern that the big corporations are able to kind of have a stronger hand in the legality components against community members. And so how could the city set these priorities that will protect the community members that are utilizing these services? You know, all in all, though, like the community members were really excited about the opportunity to have autonomous vehicles deployed in their city. I think that um, the care and the dedication to these recommendations is like that much more evidence to show that they are really excited to be a part of shaping it so that it can be something that is really beneficial to community and that is well sustained throughout its tenure in Seattle.
That's great. And great to hear that there was a lot of excitement around the project. Nico, zooming out a little bit here to a broader question, how do you think AVs can reshape urban development and land use in cities like Seattle?
Anyone who's heard me talk about this will know that I start out with, well, it depends a lot on what that deployment looks like, right? Which a lot of the people who are listening to this hopefully will have a hand in doing. So what's the scale of that deployment? In other words, how many vehicles or what percentage of trips are being done with AVs? The geographies it's just being deployed in. And, oftentimes we think about, is it going to be in the wealthier and the not wealthy areas? But I think a really big question is if it's going to be only in downtowns or central areas or entire metropolitan footprints, right? Are we going to go out to the suburbs? That is a really big question. Other big questions that are going to really affect deployment are things like, are there going to be shared vehicles or not? Probably seems to be pointing towards not, giving on a lot of the utilization that we've been seeing. But the huge one is going to be the price of trips. How much does a trip cost? And then finally, there's regulations. So putting all that all those caveats on, well, it depends, right? Some of the places, depending on some combination of those things, if we have widespread deployment, which is, lots of trips, also geographically over the entire metropolitan area, and that the price of trips is not tremendously high, we could see, a lot of shift to AVs and huge impacts on where development happens. On the one hand, you could see a lot of sprawl happening. Anytime that we've made transportation easier and with less friction, people have gone further out, right? If it's gonna, if you could go find cheaper land or a greener kind of area further out, easier, it could be that this has a lot of pressure on sprawl, and there's a lot more of that happening. There's also a ton of land use changes that could be happening. We're actually right now in the middle of a study being funded by the Mobility Center of Excellence with federal dollars. Hopefully those continue. Looking at land use and AV deployment, like the impacts. So some things like, huge impacts on auto-oriented uses. So if you think about all the gas stations and auto dealerships that exist, around the city, we could see, again, depending on all those other things before, but you could see a huge reduction in those uses. Even things like one of the interesting ones that we've been looking at is this idea of drive-throughs, where that might actually reduce substantially, because it's one thing to be driving, just be like, oh, I'll just take a right. Another thing to be like, oh, I got to like punch into the thing to tell it to go in to pick up this thing. Really, really different. One of the biggest impacts that we see is the potential for impact on parking. If AVs, depending again on a lot of the deployment things, if they're not privately owned, is a big kind of variable for this, but there's a potential to need a lot less parking. And so if that's the case, I'll tell you, studies that have looked at this have seen everything from a 95% reduction in parking to a slight increase in parking, depending on the variables. So those are really important. But if we do see a big reduction of parking, then it has huge impacts on what development can happen. Housing density can go up. Existing parking lots can be redeveloped. There's a study we did with Waymo looking at San Francisco area that's available on our website, urbanismnext.com or .org. And so lots of impacts with that. And so again, could have a huge shift in how we how the urban realm really feels. A lot of that is going to be on these variables about deployment.
Really interesting. Armand, I'm going to come back to you here. Can you share any insights on how SDOT can balance sort of community needs and concerns with innovation and advancements in the mobility sector?
Oh, for sure. And not to piggyback too much on what Nico was saying, but it really depends on also where the regulations sit and how much regulatory control the city may or may not have. A good example I like to bring up is our shared mobility program. Scooters and bikes appeared on city streets very suddenly, and it caused quite a disruption. There was kind of mayhem with parking, with users not knowing how to use the devices correctly, et cetera, et cetera. Cities like Seattle, not to toot our horn, but we took a very serious look at this new transportation mode, and we created very robust regulations for how they should operate in Seattle. And now we have record-breaking ridership. We delivered more than 6 million trips last year, with more than 500,000 of our trips being taken by our low-income discount program. So this is a very important mode for people in Seattle. And we like to use shared mobility as a great example because there's many players in this space. They compete with each other. It can be cutthroat, frankly. But because we have such robust and intentional engagement with our vendors, we're really able to support an ecosystem to have the robust ridership that we have in Seattle. And so we essentially want to take many of those lessons about how we engage with vendors, how we can help support their operations, and apply that to autonomous vehicles, recognizing that there's not a lot of differences between our shared mobility vendors and shared AV fleets. They're all wholly owned fleets. They require, coordination on where to stage vehicles. We need special events coordination. So we see a lot of similarities in how we can partner together. I also see a lot of opportunities for collaboration as it relates to incentive programs. For our shared mobility program, we have an offering called Bike and Scoot to Transit, where if you take a scooter or bike trip to or from a light rail station in Seattle, you get credits that you can use either for your light rail journey or for future bike and scooter trips. And we've seen Waymo actually take inspiration from the program that we have to do something very similar where they're offering services to the public. And so that's an example of like where there can be public-private collaboration to offer incentive programs. So that's something that we're definitely keeping an eye out. It is still very early. Washington State still remains a testing-only state. And so we're very excited to have these ideas percolating so that we can sort of be ready for when deployment eventually comes to Seattle, that we can have a suite of offerings available that really meet the transportation needs of the community.
Right. Sounds like you've really set the stage for a great engagement. Charlotte, building on that, how do you think cities can build really long-term trust with communities when introducing new transportation technologies like AVs? And what are some important engagements and activities?
Yeah, I mean, not to continue to toot Seattle's horn, but I think SDOT really did it right. The engagement with the cohort was a really solid way to kind of set a foundation for not only understanding what the needs of community members were, but introducing the conversation to say, this is what we have control over, I think was a really beneficial way for folks to understand kind of what really specific ways can we provide recommendations that SDOT can actually move with it, rather than just kind of leaving blue sky picture kind of thinking open to the group to then have folks be really disappointed when the things that they're recommending were just kind of outside of SDOT's capabilities. And so those types of kind of cohort engagements that are based in really honest and truthful conversation, really open lines of communication with the added kind of education component that Nico was able to provide, really helped the cohort deeply understand what the topics were that we were discussing, and then to kind of think and build upon each other's great ideas. Being able to have folks get familiar with the different types of technology, I think, is also really beneficial. If you're bringing this technology into their community, allowing folks to like see what it's like to ride in an autonomous vehicle and ask questions and kind of be able to experience it firsthand and kind of provide feedback on ways that that specific community would continue to benefit from it, is just helping folks get more familiar with it, so that when it is deployed, it's not just like this scary new thing that just popped up on their street one day, but they were able to kind of soft launch into it and ask a lot of questions. I think a third really strong engagement component is kind of joining on the policy train and having the different kind of community members that are really active in this space kind of join in the legislative conversations about what the deployment of autonomous vehicles looks like in their community, so that they can feel like they really had a hand in how the policy was being developed to continue to serve and can prioritize community at the center.
Fantastic. And I want to go back to something you said about folks just having the opportunity to see and try an AV for the first time at PAVE. We have seen time and time again how valuable really introductory education and just exposure to some of these technologies can really help build trust and excitement around them.
Totally.
So Nico, one of the deliverables that you're working towards here is a final report. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, yes. We are in the final throes of putting it together. We're just doing graphic design on it right now. It should be out in the next couple of weeks. So what we want to do is, we had a ton of fantastic learnings that you've been hearing about this entire webinar. We wanted to really find a way of putting that into a report that would, on the one hand, represent the conversations of the cohort, understand like what their hopes and concerns were, and have that as a resource for the city, but also the cohort and other cities and other cohorts, other stakeholders that might be interested in this. So really trying to share the knowledge that was put together here with other places. I'll say additionally, one of the hopes is that this is a resource for elected officials. As part of this, we did some interviews with elected officials, and in other research we've done a lot of interviews with elected officials. And my guess is PAVE would find something similar, that there's a whole lot of need for helping educate them on the issues. Obviously, in terms of a lot of safety kind of issues and all that, but also in terms of understanding how this might be affecting the communities that they represent. And so, really, the goal was to create something that would be sufficiently robust, but also streamlined so that it could be easily understood. So the report is really organized around the sections that Charlotte talked about before. These different topic areas, describes what the topic area was, a little bit of background of it, and then really just goes through the main points that the cohort came up with. So it's we tried really hard to keep jargon out of it. We tried really hard to make it really understandable and succinct, so that really people could understand what the issues and concerns were. As I mentioned, we are almost done with it, and it should be available to everyone shortly. I'm guessing it'll be going out through SDOT. We'll put it on the Urbanism Next site, and I'm going to guess Uncommon Bridges. And I just have to say, Uncommon Bridges was fantastic in this. They are so good at and engaging with communities, dealing with all sorts of complicated topics, and bringing a lot out of communities. They were fantastic to be working with.
Awesome. Wonderful to hear. And we are definitely looking forward to that report. So we are almost out of time here. Armand, I'm going to wrap up with one more question for you here. What is next for the AVIPC after the report is published? How do you go about implementing these findings into really actionable steps forward?
Yeah, so we've actually been keeping our cohort engaged, even though we've concluded the process. So we're currently in the Washington legislative session, and there's been numerous bills introduced on autonomous vehicles. And we keep the cohort engaged on what those bills are, if they have an interest in providing any comment, et cetera. We're really looking forward to keeping a regular cadence with them and just providing updates on the industry and any changes that might come as it relates to deployment here. And then finally, we're continuing to uplift their experiences and their voices to our partners at the AV companies. Something that we really emphasize is that no matter how the policies end up shaking out, many of these transportation impacts happen at the city level. And so the city needs to have a seat at the table to uplift what we hear from our community members. And so we just continue to be very active in having a regular cadence with the industry and really uplifting sort of our wants and needs as we hear from our communities, so that they can keep those in mind as they craft services that they continue to deploy.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Armand and Charlotte and Nico, for your time and your insights today. This was really wonderful. Just a note for our listeners, like I said, we will be posting the full recording to our YouTube channel later today. So follow us on social media to see that as soon as it's released, or check out our website, pavecampaign.org. And thank you, everybody who attended. We really appreciate your participation today.